1990s presentation topics. So for the most part, the start of the 90s, we see the final collapse of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain coming down, and we start to see areas that were formerly under the control of the USSR move towards independence movements of their own. In the 1990s, we see the idea about deficit spending, which pretty much means the government is taking in, the government's taking in 1 billion and they're spending 2 billion. That's deficit spending. So the push here is we need to try to figure out a way to reduce the deficit. And we see George Bush running for president, and he's going to argue, no new taxes. He's going to address the issue of deficit spending. However, he is definitely going to somebody dealing with global issues. And in this case, we are looking at the Gulf War. So in the Gulf War, Iraq attacks this country right here, Kuwait. The United Nations intervenes by sending a military, and that military has the goal of forcing Saddam Hussein back into Iraq. They also have United States military presence in Saudi Arabia, where Mecca and Medina are located. So if you click these links, you could see some images about the invasion. Saddam Hussein, in his attempt to deal with the attack, decides, I'm just going to set the oil fields on fire, and he ignites the Kuwaiti oil fields. This is an image of the highway of death, which should give you an idea of the devastation the United States military inflicts on the Iraqi people. By the time we get to 92, we see Clinton and Gore running for president and vice president, and we see Bush lose the election, which puts the Democrats in office. So the 90s are associated with President Clinton. We see the Republican Party trying to develop a contract with America that is dealing with some of the issues that is going to deal with here they're saying a trust between the people and their elected representatives. They want national renewal and so on. So that's the Republican Party promise. And by 94, you see the Nafta Agreement that comes into play. And that pretty much is about using North America and involving trade among these three nations here to ease up restrictions. And NAFTA would definitely be criticized by the Republicans because the argument is going to be that some level violates the contract with America. So this is going to be a easy talking point for the Republican Party. On a global scale, the United States will have troop commitment in Somalia, as will the United Nations. And that situation ends when U.S. soldiers are dragged through the streets of Somalia. This is significant because at that point, Clinton has to revise his global policy. You have to remember the Cold War ends. By the 1990s, it's over. Does the United States need to get involved around the world? And Clinton is going to argue no, especially when you see images like this take place. Nobody wants to see their own soldiers being dragged through the streets, beaten and stripped naked. So from that point on, Clinton's policy is going to be, we'll let the UN handle global issues. And then we see the Rwandan Genocide take place. So in the Rwandan Genocide, President Habyarimana is killed, and as a result, the Tutsi population of Rwanda are going to be targeted. So you have to know for the Rwandan Genocide, there's pretty much two groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi population. And there's tension going back to the end of World War I between these two groups. And the Hutu-led government is going to implement a genocide on these individuals. And the United Nations would pretty much debate if this is a genocide or a civil war or an active genocide. And that would then lead to the killing of 800,000 Tutsis throughout Rwanda. Hong Kong would go back to China. Hong Kong was controlled by the British. If we go back to the early 1900s, the late 1800s, the desire to have an open door policy in China. Now we see in the 90s that Hong Kong is going back to China, which is going to allow China to have a little more say on a global scale, as well as the Panama Canal. So the significance of these two issues is the fight for imperialism, late 1800s. Here we see Panama and China being exploited by imperial powers. And by the 90s, they're gaining their areas back. So here, Panama Canal goes back to the Panamanians, and this was addressed in the imperialism section of U.S. history. 1998, Osama bin Laden would write his declaration of war, or his fatwa, arguing why he is going to declare war on the United States. And one of the arguments he uses is the treatment of the Iraqi people. So he had to view himself as a defender of the Muslim population, and in this case, as well as the Iraqi people. Immigration push and pull factors. So if we don't know what these terms mean, they're pretty much looking at immigration, what is going to push people to leave, and what is going to pull people into the United States. And so that's kind of what this one here is about. As I kind of give you the definition here. So we're looking at some of the migration patterns with regard to the United States. Looking at this document, this is going back to the unilateral approach to global politics. That slide should have probably been earlier with the Rwandan Genocide one. I don't know why it's out of order. Anyway, this Clinton document talks about the post-Cold War period, and basically arguing that the United States is really going to take a backseat to global issues. Hillary Clinton in the 1990s was trying to develop some sort of health care plan. This would later be realized in Obama's approach to Obamacare, as it becomes known in the Obama administration. But the ideas start with Hillary Clinton in the 1990s. Clinton would be impeached for lying under oath, primarily about his relationship with one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky. And so this becomes a scandal for the Clinton administration at a time when Clinton was dealing with domestic issues as well as global, trying to figure out a way to reduce the deficit by reforming welfare programs. And here we see the unemployment rate with the presidents. Keep in mind, during Clinton's administration, you see the dot-com bubble, the end result of the ARPANET and businesses, internet businesses coming into existence, which leads to the dot-com bubble, which is part of the reason why the Clinton economy is successful. Here we see a study from a Clinton piece called Future Work that looked at the changes with regard to the labor force in the future. And so if you read this, it's pretty scary because it talks about how technology is going to demand more time. So if you work a 40-hour week in the office, you might spend 5 hours at home because the technology is now there. And then at the end, you're working 45 hours, but you're only being paid for 40. And these are all ideas that were outlined in Future Work. O.J. trial, where O.J. Simpson, a former NFL football player, was accused of killing his wife and her boyfriend, her friend. Here we click these links, we could see some of the images. And the end result was the verdict where they found O.J. not guilty, despite finding a glove that was soiled in blood and having other evidence. The reason why this is significant is because it was a situation where Black Americans, I don't want to say were happy, but they were definitely cheering, and white Americans were upset about the verdict. So it definitely looked at racial issues from the African American point of view. This was the first time when a trial for an African American being accused of a crime, in this case murder, could be found not guilty. Like if you take the O.J. trial and we put it in the time of Emmett Till in the 50s, O.J. probably would get a verdict of guilty. And so that's what made this trial significant. It looked at the racial issues and bringing up some of the racial problems in America. Similar to Hurricane Katrina, even though this is 2005, so definitely I don't know how this one got in here. This must be one of the transitions to the 2000s. With the Hurricane Katrina, which happens in New Orleans, so here we see the city underwater. There was a belief that the government didn't respond quick enough. Yeah, that one definitely seems to be out of place there. Matthew Shepard in 1998 was a gay male who was left a bar under the assumption that he was going to be in an intimate relationship with another male, and the end result was that Matthew Shepard was killed for being a homosexual. And this is why we have a day of silence to celebrate and honor the loss of Matthew Shepard's life as he, deals with issues of being homosexual, as well as homosexuals around the country that deal with remaining closeted. OJ linked to the Kardashian family. So if you're wondering why the Kardashians are pop culture icons, that's because their dad was the attorney in the OJ trial. So I guess some of these slides are out of context. Here we see a religious cult in what becomes known as the Waco Incident. Here we see David Koresh, the leader of a cult. And for the most part, they are living in this compound, and the United States government uses a tank to tear down and deal with the individuals there. Let's do a search. Here we go. I know I'm spelling this really bad. The Waco tragedy. So there you go. We see the compound on fire, the use of a tank. So really what's about to become use of law enforcement and using military tactics. In the 80s, going into the 90s, the Unabomber was somebody who was sending bombs to politicians as well as college campuses. And this individual becomes known as the Unabomber. His name was actually Ted Kaczynski. And Ted Kaczynski was later found where they linked his Unabomber manifesto. And they linked it to this former professor. TV shows, Seinfeld, Ellen, Fresh Prince, the Ellen Show, where Ellen DeGeneres, playing a heterosexual character, would later come out in her personal life, and then in the show do one of the same with her fictitious character, which was based on her life. And so that's a significant show for gay rights. Sports history, the Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding. Tonya Harding was Nancy Kerrigan's opponent, her competitor. And let's just say that in this image here, Tonya Harding's bodyguard may or may not have attacked her, damaging Nancy Kerrigan physically to prevent her from performing. We see some movies, Titanic and the Blair Witch. The Blair Witch, which was shot in kind of a real-time method, which changed cinema by using real-life footage or to try to project an image in the film of this is actual footage of an individual. So the Blair Witch Project, Titanic, one of the highest grossing films. We have the cloning of a sheep. We have Tower Records, which was selling records and CDs and tapes, and their competition becomes Napster, eventually putting them out of business, where Sean Fanning created software that was designed to allow you to upload your CD into this particular computer, and then I can, with my computer, access the files there and download them to mine. And this revolutionized and pretty much killed the music industry. 2000, we have a disputed election between Al Gore and Bush, and we see the electoral votes under dispute, and that will take us into the 2000s. So that's it.